After the regular session, Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill into law that bans Texas schools from teaching critical race theory. It's a concept that racism is systemic and upheld by inequality in the legal system. But the legislation Abbott signed goes beyond banning that concept. It requires students to read certain books about America's founding, bans teaching that anyone is inherently racist, and blocks teachers from taking a side during current events. The governor says more needs to be done. He called on lawmakers to revisit the topic during a special session. Before they returned to the Capitol, politics reporter John Engel had separate interviews with two lawmakers on different sides of the debate. Their answers give insight into why this issue causes so much division.
How do you describe critical race theory? Because I think on both sides and all over the place, it was overshadowed a lot by the fights and by the rhetoric. How do you define it and what we are trying to keep out of our classroom?
Sure, and I think you're right. I think there was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of hyperbole. At the end of the day, what we all have to agree, and I think do agree, is that we should be able to teach history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? All of it, but also in the fairest, most honest, unbiased way possible. And for me, what this bill does, and maybe what the bill and the special will do even more so, is describe how and we want these items to be taught in an unbiased way. I'll give you an example. One of the items, for instance, in my amendment was that teachers can't be trained to teach that one gender is superior to another, that one race is superior to another. I mean, I think we can all agree that that's what we want, is for all of our children to get all of the facts, learn as much about history as we can in the limited time that they have to be able to do that, to hit the core fundamental policies that created this country, and do it in a way that looks at every side of the issue.
What do you think is the biggest misconception, or what played out during this session that you saw totally missed the boat or whatever when it comes to critical race theory?
So two things. One is, if you would have told me in December before our January session started that we would be working to ban critical race theory, I would have never believed you. It wasn't on anyone's radar. I've served on the public education committee. It hadn't even been a conversation, but here this bill emerged very rapidly. And so you have to think, well, why did it emerge very rapidly and with such fervor? Well, it's because there are strategic forces who want to push this agenda. And so as I started to ask my colleagues, well, why don't you like critical race theory? As someone who has a PhD in education, where I use critical studies and critical race theory as an analytical tool to do my research, there was two things that quickly emerged. One is a misunderstanding of CRT, and two, recognizing that it was more about politics than policy. The reality is our local schools aren't teaching CRT. CRT is a graduate level academic theory. This is being used to talk about other things that people feel anxious about.
Critical race theory isn't new. So why now, and why are we seeing it all over the place?
Well, I would say, like in our case, in my district, it had kind of started in some of what at least my constituents and parents in our school districts felt was this was kind of being pushed from the other direction. It was being pushed years ago. Even 2 years ago in our school district, there was a lot of community meetings talking about plans and how to do it. So while I think it may seem like it came all of a sudden, that may just be because that's when the legislature actually comes into session. We do get a couple of years off, and in that time, we hear about the issues that are happening.
And I think the umbrella topic was said to be critical race theory, but banning the discussion of current events in race and politics isn't really what critical race theory even is, right?
It's become the scapegoat for trying to ban conversations with young people about current events, about race, about gender. It's just really trying to say we only want to teach one way, and that's the only way. And it's really handcuffing our teachers. For the longest time, elected officials have said, let's let teachers teach when it comes to standardized testing. But now we're being honestly a little bit hypocritical when we're handcuffing teachers and saying, well, you can't talk about this, and you can't talk about this, and you can't talk about this. And it leaves a lot of ambiguity for an educator to navigate the classroom. What happens if one of your students has experienced racism and they come to you to talk about it? How will the teacher feel if they feel that they can't talk to the student? And how will that relationship between the student and teacher really be impacted?
Do you believe that it limits at all what a teacher is able to speak about in terms of, say, the death of George Floyd or Mike Ramos here in Austin or Javier Ambler? I mean, name your flashpoint. Do you think it limits them at all?
No, I don't. In fact, in a lot of ways, it just means that you have to spend more time on those important topics and to get as much feedback. See, at the end of the day, when you want to have, what I think we want to have in a classroom, as much communication, debates, both pro and con, to be able to get primary sources about what happened in any incident. But you can't have those conversations if some of the students, for instance, don't feel that it's appropriate for them to be involved in those conversations. So I think this actually ends up opening it up for even more dialogue and more conversation about those issues.
A lot have pointed out that the reboot of the critical race theory debate is coming the same week that we have federal legislation authorizing Juneteenth as a federal holiday.
You know, I've worked in politics.
Well, I know you're not surprised. I know you're not surprised.
I was like, you're right. Like,
yeah.
You know.
But can we even talk about what Juneteenth is the real
right?
question.
Like, I mean, that's yes. And so I really want people to go read what that piece of legislation is, because there's a headline and then there's a reality. And the reality was saying that there are certain books that students should read and other books that they shouldn't. And I'll give an example. One of the books that they encouraged students to read was a book by Tocqueville, which talked about justifying slavery. Like, this is the books we want kids to read, but let's not read any of the other books, right? And I think it just really speaks to, this is not about policy. This is not about practical reality of students and teachers. It's about a political agenda.
Texas voters appear to be split over the question of how students should learn about racism. A poll from the University of Texas and the Texas Tribune asked voters whether they supported limiting the emphasis of racism when teaching U.S. history. 44% said yes, 45% said no. But there's a sharp divide when it comes to political affiliation. Nearly 70% of Republicans supported limits on materials that emphasize racism in U.S. history. 75% of Democrats said they oppose limits. Decisions at the Capitol will lead to new investment to protect the Texas coastline from hurricanes.
These storms impact our state in so many ways.
Why the legislation got support from lawmakers who live far from the coast.